This film is based on a true story. Betty Broderick has everything anyone could dream of. She is a homemaker, a mother of 4, and the wife of successful attorney Dan Broderick. Betty is happy, though she has sacrificed a great deal. While her husband built his career, she took care of everything, from making their house a home to raising the children. The couple goes to a Halloween party. Everyone congratulates Dan on recently winning a case on which he staked his reputation and much more. As always, Dan is the center of attention. Eager to impress, he invites his friends to Paris. Betty is annoyed that her husband did not warn her, because now she will not have time to get her nails done. San Diego, California. Dan's colleague Kevin McDonald announces that his wife, Susan McDonald, has filed for divorce. Dan feels sorry for his friend, but he has no time to dwell on it. Today he is coaching a group of young scouts. Dan takes an active role in the community, and Betty supports her husband in everything he does. Everyone loves Dan. Betty wants to be the perfect wife for him and the perfect mother to their 4 children. But is Dan really the perfect husband he makes himself out to be? Soon afterward, Betty picks Dan up from the airport after a business trip to Seattle. When she asks whether anything interesting happened there, Dan simply brushes her off and says it was business as usual. Later, the couple attends a St. Patrick's Day celebration. Dan's colleagues are there with their spouses. Betty hears people whispering behind her back, wondering what Dan ever saw in her. He is charming and successful and could have any woman he wants. Plenty of beautiful women have their eyes on him. That evening Betty studies her reflection in the mirror for a long time. She is no longer as young and attractive as she once was. The woman has devoted her entire life to her family, yet she has never regretted her choice. Soon the family goes to a ski resort and settles into a cozy rental cabin. The spouses argue because Dan is throwing money around just to impress his friends. Betty runs the household, looks after the children, and does everything she can to spare Dan from having to worry about life at home, yet for some reason no one ever takes her opinion into account. Betty has had enough. The couple moves into a new house. Since Dan is constantly busy at work, Betty handles most of the move. Meanwhile he hires an attractive young woman named Linda as his assistant. Betty goes shopping with her friend Susan McDonald and learns for the first time that she and Kevin are getting divorced. On the one hand, Susan feels relieved because she has been unhappy in the marriage for a long time. On the other, she feels as though life has passed her by. She is no longer young and has no idea how to start over. For now, shopping at least makes her life a little brighter. For Dan's birthday, Betty decides to surprise him and goes to his office with a small cake and champagne. Dan, however, is not there. His secretary says he went to lunch with Linda. Upset, Betty decides to wait for her husband at the office. Evening comes, and Dan still has not shown up. He returns home very late. Betty accuses her husband of having an affair with his 19-year-old assistant, but Dan denies everything, claiming that he spent all 7 hours away from the office meeting clients or running errands. Betty does not believe a word he says, and in a fit of rage sets some of his clothes on fire. This moment becomes the point of no return. Meanwhile Dan grows closer to Linda, and their relationship shifts from professional to personal. Dan constantly stays late at work because at home he faces a tired, irritable wife and children who need his attention. Here on the other hand a beautiful young woman flirts with him, admires him, and showers him with praise. Dan invites Linda to take a ride in his expensive new car. They drive around until late in the evening. Betty cannot understand why her husband is unhappy when she has always done everything for him and their family. It is her support and patience that have allowed him to afford a new car and everything else he has. Christmas arrives, and it is time to open the presents. Dan has chosen a ring for his wife even though she asked for something entirely different. Betty cannot understand why Dan is so indifferent to what she wants and always does things his own way. He could at least listen to her once in a while. The spouses argue right in front of their children. The holiday is completely ruined. Soon afterward, the couple goes to a restaurant. Dan has invited his wife there not simply for dinner but because he wants to talk to her away from home. A very difficult and unpleasant conversation lies ahead. Dan has been preparing for it for a long time. Lately, the relationship between the spouses has been falling apart, and the unhealthy atmosphere at home is taking a toll on the children. Dan says he is going to move out for a while so he can think everything over. He genuinely cannot go on like this. Betty cannot believe their 16-year marriage is being thrown away and everything is falling apart over some lunch. She gave Dan everything and has received nothing but betrayal in return. Betty contemptuously tells him that he cannot handle his own midlife crisis. If it were not for her, he would still be working in an emergency room for next to nothing. Dan does not diminish Betty's contribution to the family's well-being in the slightest, but it is perfectly clear that their marriage is falling apart. She criticizes everything he does. Perhaps they would be much happier apart. Betty, however, has no intention of simply letting Dan go, believing that he owes her. Either way, Dan has already made up his mind. He packs his bags and moves into their house by the ocean. Betty decides to act immediately and leaves their children on Dan's doorstep one after another. She wants to show him that he cannot manage without his wife. Dan has always strived to have the best of everything. The best house, the finest suits, and invitations to the best parties. No wonder women fall for him. Betty cannot allow a man like that to end up with someone else. Dan and Linda have dinner at a restaurant. He thanks her for being so sensitive and understanding and for knowing how to listen. That is exactly what has been missing from his marriage. With Linda, Dan feels young and free again. Meanwhile, Betty reflects on her life. When you reach 40 and reap the rewards of everything you worked for in your 20s and 30s, it is the best time of your life, you have money, and you can enjoy it. Turning 40 makes all the years leading up to it worthwhile. Betty visits the children, who are now living with Dan. While he is at work, she checks his refrigerator to prove to herself that he is failing as a father. Kate Broderick, the oldest daughter, helps take care of the younger children. Betty is puzzled when she finds a pie in the refrigerator. The children explain that Linda baked it. Betty is consumed with hatred. When Dan returns home after an exhausting day at work, he finds the pie Linda baked smeared all over his bed and clothes. His face has been crossed out in the family photographs. Soon afterward, Betty receives divorce papers along with a request for a court order barring her from seeing the children. She immediately goes to Dan's house and pounds furiously on his door. When no one answers, the woman smashes the glass in the back door and breaks in. No one appears to be home. Enraged, Betty destroys the furniture. She finds a can of spray paint and covers the walls with graffiti. Even then, the woman does not stop, leaving the house completely trashed. Realizing that Dan holds all the cards, Betty hires a lawyer. No lawyer will be able to help her, however, if she keeps threatening Dan, breaking into his house, and damaging his belongings. A court order keeping her from seeing the children is extremely serious. Realizing that there is no point in appealing to Betty's better judgment, the lawyer refuses to represent her. If Betty continues like this, Dan has every chance of gaining sole custody of the children after the divorce. He plans to sell their old house as soon as possible, split the money evenly, and put an end to all of this. Betty makes it clear that she wants at least $1 million. That is a great deal of money. Finding a buyer at that price will be difficult. Dan reminds her that he worked hard to buy the house, but Betty does not care. She makes it clear that she will not settle for anything less. While Linda looks forward to a glamorous life with her new boyfriend, Dan tries to figure out what to do. The house clearly has to be sold, and Betty has deliberately set an impossible condition. As the divorce proceedings drag on, tensions within the family escalate. Kate sides with her mother and accuses her father of destroying everything they had for the sake of a foolish affair. Kate visits her mother even though the girl is not allowed to be there without her father's supervision. Meanwhile, Betty continues looking for a lawyer who can crush Dan in court. But everyone turns her down because they know Dan's reputation. Every day, the man finds threatening voice messages from Betty on his answering machine. The more he ignores her, the angrier she becomes. When Betty learns that Dan sold the house without her consent, she makes a scene. She screams that he had no right because it was her house. Dan refuses to continue the conversation and will not allow her to be alone with the children. Since Betty feels she has nothing left to lose, she gets into her car and begins ramming Dan's house, terrifying him and the children. Dan forcibly pulls his wife out of the car. Hysterical, she lunges at him, and things might have gone even further if the police had not arrived and arrested Betty. The woman is released on the condition that she see a psychiatrist. Betty talks about how difficult the divorce has been for her and promises to control herself from now on, but she is merely putting on an act. Determined to ruin her husband's reputation, she gives interviews to journalists and claims that Dan took everything from her and left her for his mistress. Betty portrays herself as a victim whose husband left her penniless after 16 years of marriage, and discarded her like a useless object. Dan celebrates Christmas with the children and Linda. Betty watches them from her car. After waiting for everyone to leave, she goes inside the house even though she is forbidden from being there. Kate comes in first and asks her mother to leave when she sees her. If Dan finds Betty there, he will call the police. Betty feels rejected. Her old life has been taken from her, and she has been cast aside. In a burst of rage, the woman begins destroying the Christmas presents. Kate tries to stop her mother and gets hit as well. Betty immediately embraces her daughter, repeating that she did not mean to do it. The day of Betty and Dan's divorce hearing arrives. The woman flatly refuses to consent to the divorce, but the court rules that given Betty's unstable behavior, there are no grounds to delay it. From this moment on, they are officially divorced. Betty calls her old acquaintance Marge and suggests they have lunch together. The woman makes up ridiculous excuses on the spot, but Betty keeps insisting. Marge finally says bluntly that she moves in the same social circles as Dan and Linda, so she is no longer comfortable associating with Betty. Hurt, the woman calls Dan again and launches into threats and insults, realizing too late that the person on the other end is not her ex-husband but her son Grant Broderick. Betty tries to persuade the boy to live with her, but Grant refuses. He says they are very happy there and that Linda has fit perfectly into their family. This enrages Betty even more. This time Dan goes to the Halloween party with Linda. As they sway together in a slow dance, Dan proposes to her. Linda of course says yes. After learning of her ex-husband's engagement, Betty does everything she can to turn the children against Dan. No other woman can replace their mother. Betty tries to convince the children that their father no longer loves them. But Dan loves his children dearly and explains that his new marriage is simply a new chapter in his life. He would like to improve his relationship with his ex-wife for the children's sake, but Betty apparently will never accept that things between them are over. She cannot let go of the past. Betty goes to a gun store and buys a revolver. If she cannot get Dan back, she will make sure no one else can have him. But Betty hates Linda even more. She constantly harasses them with phone calls. The restraining order means nothing to Betty. She screams into the phone that she will soon put an end to Dan's philandering once and for all. At Kate's high school graduation, Betty and Linda come face to face. Betty begins taking pictures of her rival. Unsure what to expect from his ex-wife, Dan hurries to get his fiancée away from there. Linda cannot take it anymore. Dan promises to change the locks and the phone number, but they both realize that this is unlikely to stop Betty. She stole their wedding guest list, but they cannot prove it, so the police will not be able to help them. Nevertheless, the couple decides to go to the police. As expected, Betty denies in court that she stole the list. The judge suspends Dan's alimony payments until she returns it. Linda is now seriously afraid for her life and breaks into Betty's house to find proof that she is mentally unstable. When Dan learns what happened, he asks Linda to return everything she took. They could be in serious trouble. The thought that her ex-husband is about to get married is unbearable for Betty. She is not going to take it lying down. Dan even has to wear a bulletproof vest under his suit out of fear that his ex-wife will carry out her threats. On their wedding day, the newlyweds try not to think about anything bad and simply enjoy the celebration. Fortunately, everything goes off without incident. But the peace does not last long. Betty continues stalking the couple. Wherever they go, she turns up. Dan even thinks Betty might calm down if they give her regular visitation with the children. In any case, he does not believe Betty is capable of hurting them. She was once a loving mother. Contrary to Dan's expectations, however, Betty flies into an even greater rage. She does not need favors from her ex-husband. Susan, who has also been through a divorce, tries to convince Betty to let go of the past and move on. If Betty does not stop, she risks losing her children forever. She could focus on herself, find a new man, or take up a hobby. Instead of listening to good advice, Betty accuses her friend of betrayal. She genuinely believes that Dan has bought Susan's loyalty, along with that of everyone else in their social circle. Betty's jealousy and hatred reach such a pitch that madness seems like the only way out. In the middle of the night, she takes her revolver, sneaks into Dan and Linda's house, and shoots them as they sleep. Wounded, Dan reaches for the phone to call 911. Betty immediately takes the receiver away from him. By the time help arrives, Dan will already be dead. Betty ends up in prison. She shows no remorse. A voiceover then tells us that Betty Broderick was convicted of the double murder. She received the maximum sentence of 32 years to life in prison.